for Forests, an organization working towards restoring agricultural land. So, welcome, Kritika. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast to talk about Farmers for Forests.
Thanks, Anish. Excited to be here.
So, you launched this initiative in 2019. So, what is the idea behind it?
Right. Okay. So essentially in 2009, when I was an undergraduate student, I was doing a lot of work around Anna Hazare's village, Raigan Siddhi, in Maharashtra, and also just trying to understand because he did a lot of community-based development there, and we were just trying to understand and the like he spent 20 years in the village, transformed this village, and the government tried to scale this up to from one village to 300 villages, and it wasn't as successful. And we were just I was just trying to understand what was the reason for the success. And one of the reasons that we realized is that in villages where there was natural capital, where environmental degradation was low, these villages were able to use the resources to really expand development. And this was something, so this I studied this in 2009 and 2010, and at that time I had focused a lot on social capital. When I was analyzing, I was just looking through the data later in 2016, we realized that villages that have restored environment or already have an existing strong environmental framework, etc., in place, were doing really well. And the idea was, how do you promote this at scale? Right? Because we see a lot of examples of, like small successes, etc., whether it's forest protection or agroforestry, which is the two things that we work on. But how do you do this at scale? And when we sort of did like a good literature review, we realized that payments for ecosystem services, which is essentially adequately compensating communities for the environmental services that they are providing, is one way, I think, to really do this quickly and do it at scale, which is the idea that we wanted to try out. And that's how we started Farmers for Forests.
So, could you just elaborate a bit on your operating model?
Yes. So essentially, we work with communities on the ground. So we do both forest protection and agroforestry. So in forest protection, essentially what we do is we work with communities to reduce incidences of forest fire and illegal logging. With other farmer communities, we essentially work with them to transition them to agroforestry from monoculture, which is, let's say, doing sugarcane or onion or things which are very fertilizer and water intensive, to more biodiverse, just agroforestry. So we work with the communities to do these interventions on the ground. Then we measure ecosystem services. When I say ecosystem services, we just look at primarily two things, which is carbon and biodiversity. What is the carbon and biodiversity benefits of doing this on the ground? And then we essentially financially compensate communities for this. That is one way. And then we also work with them for them to kind of get financially remunerative models around this. So for example, if it's forestry, then existing forest, then there's honey and bamboo. And then if it's agroforestry, it's a lot of fruits and again, bamboo and things like that. So the idea is to make forestry, agroforestry, as financially viable for communities as, say, something like sugarcane or millet cultivation is. Because if it's financially viable for communities, communities will continue to do it in the long term and at scale. So how do you ensure that farmers and communities get an adequate income from protecting the environment, the same that they would get maybe from doing, let's say, timber cultivation or sugarcane or things like that? So that's essentially what we try to figure out with communities.
You mentioned about converting monocultures to agroforest. So, firstly, what exactly is an agroforest, and why is it so important to reduce the dependence on monoculture?
So, couple of things. So, monocultures is anything where, like, farmers, so say you're a farmer, you have 2 acres of land, and on that 2 acres, you're doing only rice cultivation, or you're doing only soybean cultivation, or you're doing only let's say something like sugarcane. So now the problem with this is, so I'll just give you the example of Gadchiroli, which is one of the districts where we work. So they do rice cultivation, which is actually not very environmentally unfriendly because they don't use groundwater and they don't use external fertilizers. But the biggest problem that we're seeing with this rice cultivation in the last couple of years is that rainfall has been extremely erratic. Like, yes, last year there was a flood. This year there's been, significantly lower than expected rainfall. So communities are significantly losing their rice harvest, right? So they're hardly earning 7 or 8,000 rupees. So now in this, instead of, if you're doing rice cultivation, let's say you do 1 acre of rice cultivation, you do 1 acre of bamboo. Bamboo is incredibly resilient in the sense that the bamboo plantations that have not received rainfall for 3 months are also still surviving. Very easy to plant. You don't require anything, requires much less water than rice, grows very naturally in that region. So now if you're a farmer and you're transitioning from doing, rainfall dependent agriculture to doing this bamboo on 1 acre, you're essentially able to get from year one an income of nearly 10,000 or so rupees, which comes from the ecosystem services, which is essentially in this case primarily carbon sequestration and a little bit of biodiversity, because along with the bamboo we plant about 5 to 10% trees which are just for sheer biodiversity, trees that are declining in Maharashtra. So trees like bale or trees like Dalbergia latifolia, which is shisham, things like that. So this essentially, from the carbon, from the biodiversity, the farmers get paid for 3 years, and then from year 4 onwards, they can sustainably harvest the bamboo. So from the farmer's point of view, they are moving towards a more climate resilient form of cultivation. They were getting 7, 8,000 with rice. With this, for a ton of bamboo, a minimum, you can sell it for 5,000 to 6,000 rupees in the market. And you can continue to harvest from year 3 onwards. You can continue to harvest that bamboo every year. So essentially what we're seeing with communities is that communities that are getting this income from forests. So one is like doing more agroforestry, and 2 is like already relying on existing forests because they're already relying on cultivating bamboo from the forest, doing mahua cultivation, doing tendu cultivation. So this is proving to be far more climate resilient than traditional agriculture, and it requires lesser inputs. So this is more in the forest areas. In areas like Marathwada, which is in central Maharashtra, there we're essentially transitioning farmers to doing mango, lemon, or sitafal, guava, sitafal, aula, which requires 90% less water, doesn't use any chemical fertilizers, and is more climate resilient for farmers than doing, let's say, only sugarcane or onion. Again, along with the sort of 90% fruit trees and bamboo, 5 to 10% trees are bio for both the biodiversity and the carbon sequestration.
So, how have farmers responded to your initiatives?
Pretty well, actually. So in the first couple of years when we started, we were not doing a lot of fruit trees. We were doing more trees which had just pure biodiversity value, which didn't have a very big commercial value. And the take up of that and selling that to farmers was very hard because from a farmer's point of view, the economics matter a lot. But when we've kind of transitioned the model to include what farmers want, but at the same time tried to make it more ecologically friendly than what they were doing before, the response has been really good. Because what we realized is that if you want this to kind of stay for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, you have to have the communities on board. Like the community really needs to believe in what they're doing, because at the end of the day, it is their land, it is their livelihood. So if we are not able to find that balance between ecology and economy for them, for the farmer, whatever you do is just not going to sustain in the long
One
run.
of the key criticisms of afforestation projects is the low sapling survival rate, but this is not the case with farmers for forests. So, how do you ensure a high sapling survival rate through your afforestation project?
So our honestly, in the first few years, our afforestation projects didn't have a high success rate because we weren't giving farmers the saplings we wanted, right? We were giving them wild trees, and farmers didn't want wild trees. But once you're able to kind of find that balance between what the farmer wants, so earlier we were doing 80% biodiverse trees, just 20% fruit trees. And that model didn't work that well because farmers wanted more fruit trees. So what we realized is that we have a choice, which is we can work with, let's say, 20, 30 farmers who agree to doing 80% biodiversity and 20% fruit trees, or we can work with 5,000, 10,000 farmers who agree to 90, 95% fruit trees and 5 to 10% biodiverse trees, and we're getting sort of the same number. And I think sometimes, because this was one of the lessons we learned, which is you also have to look at what are the alternative land use patterns, because if, for example, we don't, kind of work with the farmers, farmers are going to give that land maybe to, just sell the soil on that land for road construction, right? Because at the end of the day, the farmer's economy matters. So is it better that the farmer sells the land for soil on the land for road construction? Or is it better that the farmer plants 90% fruit trees and 5 to 10% biodiverse trees? So when we were trying to design for scale, these were some of the things that we were thinking of, because earlier our idea was like, hey, is more fruit trees just getting in biodiversity? But I think the way to also think about it is like, if it weren't more fruit trees, that land would maybe just be soybean cultivation. So this is not the most perfect model in terms of ecology, but it's also much better than what a farmer would have done otherwise. And it's sustainable and scalable, which was like kind of a new line of thinking which we had to introduce. And we only work on agriculture. When we do afforestation, it's only done on agriculture land. We don't do afforestation on grasslands or commons land or things like that. It's land that would have otherwise been used for agriculture. So this is still better than what the alternative land use would have been.
Why is the proper selection of site so critical for the success of afforestation projects?
So, honestly, again, with the only reason we don't do it on grasslands is because most of these grasslands are owned and managed jointly by the community. And I think our model works much better for individual farmers. But what we've seen is that, of course, you shouldn't plant on grasslands because that's not what would work there, or that's not what's ecologically sustainable there. But what we've also seen is that in a lot of cases, like, the best scenario would be for the grassland to exist as is, right? Like, we have farmers who own 100 acres of grassland where, they had we saw a lot of like just the grassland restoring naturally, clumps of these tree guilds that came up. You see that pattern repeated everywhere. Clearly, just planting fruit trees or anything on that land wouldn't work. But for the sort of challenge that we run up against is that right now the farmers have let it be a grassland, and you could see porcupine and nilgai and all of these things. But if the farmers were not able to get a remuneration, their alternate land use was that they were going to give that land for either solar panels to solar panel developers. They were going to sell the soil to for road construction, or the third was they were going to rent out the land for open kind of grazing to other farmers, like nomadic farmers. So for us, the real struggle was that, like, if you have to convince the farmer who owns this land, who is an owner for whom it's an asset, to keep it as a grassland, how do you financially compensate that farmer to do that? And philanthropy can do that to a certain extent. But even with philanthropy, nobody is willing to paid to do it for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. So with that, like if you're a farmer and let's say you have, 100 acres of grassland, thriving ecosystem, you haven't done anything, it's very far away from where you live. Now, if I have to convince you to keep that land as is, how do I make the economics work for you? And that is the sort of question that we keep running up against, because if you have to do this at scale and you have to do this sustainably, you have to make the economics work for the farmer. In most cases, we are not able to do that, which is why these lands then get, like either get into soil mining or solar panels and things like that. So there needs to be something beyond, maybe ecotourism or whatever, that like there has to be a model that works for the farmers. So that's why we don't work on these lands, because we don't know what a model is that would financially work here for farmers.
So, what is your long-term vision for farmers for forests?
Um, I think if we have to, um, you know, do restoration at scale, it has to be done in a way that communities benefit from this, right? So, for example, just to give you an example, one of the things we're trying to do is that we're trying to get farmers better prices for maua that has been harvested without anthropogenic fires. Because these forest fires often are lit to harvest maua, they get out of control, burn vast tracts of forest. So, how do you convince and the problem is, like, two communities have been doing this for years and it worked out okay because there was enough forest and there was enough, but as the forest has declined, all of these practices have really harmful effects. So how do you kind of make the economics work for the farmer? How do you get them a better price? Because harvesting maua without fires will require more effort on their part. So how do you kind of convince them to harvest maua without lighting fires and financially compensate them in the long term? So these are some of the things that I think we're trying to figure out, which is how do you find that balance between doing ecologically sound things and ensuring that farmers get adequately compensated for doing ecologically sound things, so that they have enough incentive to continue doing it in the long term without philanthropy or without something else having to kind of constantly prop that up. I think that's what we are trying to figure out. There are no easy answers.
And my final question is that how can individuals contribute to farmers for forests?
I think honestly, what I've realized is the biggest thing that we as individuals can do is like mindful consumerism. So, for example, if you're buying from brands that are selling probably more expensive products, but have supply chains that are deforestation free, have products that are ethically, sustainably harvested, costs a lot more. But I think like if companies kind of get that message from more and more consumers, which is happening, I think that in itself would probably be far bigger than individually contributing to farmers for forests.
Yep, sir. That is my final question for this interview. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Anish.
And that's the end of another episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and would love to hear more, don't forget to press the subscribe button and obviously share with your friends.